Okay, welcome everyone to this third session of the conference on vulnerability today. My name is Dr. Yasha Luzak, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Exeter Law School, and it's my pleasure to chair this session today. We have three fantastic speakers with us from different areas, disciplines, different practice, academia. So it will be, I think, very interesting to hear their views on vulnerability. I would like to just remind everyone that we are recording this session. Please ensure that you are muted unless you want to ask a question and unless I give you the floor. You are kindly asked to submit your questions also via chat, if that's possible, during the sessions. Hopefully we will have enough time to allow everyone to ask their question in person after the session finishes. But since we will have 15 minutes per presentation and then 15 minutes left for the discussion, if the discussion is very lively, as we hope it will be, we may actually run out of time for all questions. So it will be good if you put them in the chat and we will be able to then address them as well there. I won't take more time. I will move on to the first speaker for this session. It's my pleasure to introduce Catherine Ross, the Strategy and Regulatory Affairs Director at Thames Water. She is responsible there for delivering the regulatory and corporate strategy, and she will talk to us about vulnerability in utilities.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for organising this excellent conference. It's very timely, and I feel that very acutely, actually, for reasons that we might get to at the end of my presentation. Just a little bit more, just to give you the context of perhaps why I'm saying what I'm saying. I'm currently working at Thames Water, looking after strategy and regulatory affairs. Prior to that, I worked at BT, but for 20 years previous to that, I was a regulator. I worked for regulators and competition authorities, and I think, or at least I like to think, it gives me a slightly broader perspective on some of these issues. So and we might touch on some of that as we go through. So, I mean, the first thing I wanted to say, and I am going to talk principally here about utility sectors and perhaps particularly about energy and water, and then obviously I will spotlight some water issues as I go through. I think the first thing to say is we have come an enormously long way, I think, in utility sectors in thinking about vulnerability. And I remember when I first joined Ofwat, which I think was back in 2007, so it feels like prehistory now. When we talked about vulnerable customers, it tended to be by reference to a particular part of the Water Industry Act 1991, which listed out a series of groups that were considered to be particularly vulnerable, including those on dialysis and the elderly, etc., etc., etc. And I would sort of characterise the thinking about vulnerable customers in that era as being almost one of compliance. It was almost a sort of compliance mentality. You know, have companies done what they needed to do given the legislative requirements on them? And I think we've come an awfully long way since then. And I remember when I was at Ofwat the second time, and I think it was back in 2015, there was this really seminal paper from the Financial Conduct Authority called Consumer Vulnerability. And it really redefined what regulators and indeed regulated companies thought of as vulnerability. And it really sort of catapulted us beyond that kind of list of special interest groups into understanding that at any one time, 50% of consumers can be in circumstances that render them vulnerable to harm. And it was this idea that vulnerability related to circumstances rather than particularly clearly observable sort of factors. That really sort of catapulted to the front of everybody's mind the fact that there is a strong link between just great customer service, actually of really knowing and understanding your customers, to actually then being able to sort of protect them and support them and serve them in the best way possible. It was a huge wake-up call, that piece of research, and I remember it really changed the conversation at Ofwat between Ofwat and the regulated companies. It was fantastic. So, you know, and I think we're also increasingly aware, partly because of that emphasis on circumstantial sort of vulnerability, that vulnerability is not a static picture. And you probably talked about this in the morning session, but I mean, you know, we've learned a lot in COVID, for example, about different factors that drive vulnerability. And you know, we know, I think, that the number of people on universal credits doubled, I think, since March last year, which is a hell of a statistic. And I think that the shift during COVID towards digital access for services has been incredibly empowering and inclusory for some groups, but actually very exclusionary for others. So not only I think have we got a greater awareness now in utility sectors about what vulnerability means, we've also got this awareness that it is actually often circumstantial and therefore will change over time. And I think if we're going to meet those challenges, then obviously I think there's been a realization that we needed to think outside the box. So regulated companies and utility sectors needed to do things differently. And in particular, sort of moving away from this idea of the customer as the bill payer, and how do we support this bill payer in paying their bill, to something that is more sort of what we in Thames Water refer to as effortless and caring, and with an emphasis on empowerment and making people aware of the support that's available to them. But I think one of the things that it has prompted, this idea that you sort of look at the person, as it were, rather than the bill payer, is that you quite quickly realise that vulnerability is a cross-sector issue. It isn't something that neatly sits in a box called water or sits in a box called energy. It's actually about human beings and the situation that they find themselves in. So one of the things we've been doing quite a lot of recently, for example, has been partnership working. So at Thames Water, we've got a partnership with UK Power Networks. They're the energy network provider in London, and we share data as between their priority services register and our essential services network, because if you're vulnerable in respect of your energy supply, it may well be that you're vulnerable in respect of your water supply as well. So it helps us to pick up and identify those groups that might need some special assistance. We also need to work more in partnership with others. And again, to give you an example, there is no substitute, I think, if you really want to get to know your customers, there is no substitute for the kind of face-to-face interaction. But that's difficult to do. It's difficult to get around everybody. It's difficult to do those visits. So one of the things we've been doing at Thames has been we've been partnering with the London Fire Brigade, because London Fire Brigade does these things called safe and well visits. And that takes them into people's homes. And as they go into people's homes, they can spot customers who may be in need of more support. And they have felt able to share that information with us, partly because they've got the consent from the customers that they visit to share data with trusted entities, and also because they believe that our interests as Thames Water are aligned with their interests as the London Fire Brigade in terms of protecting those customers and keeping them safe. And that's been really powerful for us. We've also done a lot to think differently about how we empower customers and we make things accessible to customers. So, for example, you using digital services to improve accessibility of support for some people, for example, through our one and done approach to accessing our social tariff. So, things are happening, and good and useful things are happening. To think outside the box, to be more human-centric, to look outside our own organisations, and to not be proud and not think we've got the right answers to everything, but to work with others. And that's fine, right? That's all good and useful stuff. But the thing I wanted to perhaps particularly to emphasise in the remaining time that I've got left is the fact that I think we've got to have some huge challenges ahead in utility sectors. And although I have talked about this sort of redefinition of vulnerability, if you like, in the last sort of decade, so that we do see the human being rather than the bill payer. Actually, the thing that I want to highlight right now is a particular issue in the context of the customer as bill payer. And I think this is something that I worry about a great deal, actually, in my current role at Thames Water. I think we are walking into a very substantial affordability challenge, and therefore the need to think in quite a different way, a much more creative way about how we tackle issues of financial vulnerability and avoid issues of financial vulnerability when it comes to utility bills. So, when I was thinking about this, I was reflecting on the fact that I am now one of these dinosaurs who turns up to conferences and reflects on things that happened decades ago. And in my case, one of the things that happened a long time ago in my history was I remember a report from the NAO back in 2013. I think it was called Infrastructure Investment, the Impact on Consumer Bills. And it was a really interesting report. And what they'd done is they basically looked across energy, water, and telecoms, which was radical, right? Radical in itself in 2013, bearing in mind this is before the FCA's Consumer Vulnerability Report. And one of the things they noted was that at the time, there was something like £310 billion worth of planned infrastructure investment across these sectors. And the question the NAO was asking was, has anybody looked at how this is going to get paid for from the perspective of the consumer? because their worry was that you put all of this sort of bow wave of investment that's going to be needed through the sort of the bills that land on your doormat for your energy and for your telecoms and for your water. And although, you know, incrementally each one of them might be reasonable, if you add them all up together and realize that the same consumer is going to have to pay all of this, are we all okay with that? You know, do we all think that that is affordable? Do we think that that's fine? And the conclusion that they came to, unsurprisingly, was that, well, nobody was actually really asking that question. And I remember being at a select committee hearing on behalf of Ofwat, and the select committee saying to me, what are you doing about this? And I remember talking about some work that we were doing through the UK regulators network to join up and ask these questions. But in reality, not a lot actually happened. And we didn't really change our approach because it's hard, you know, it would have involved a new way of looking at this stuff. And I think, you know, to be brutally honest, I think we're staring at a similar problem today, but you know, frankly, with bells and whistles on it. So, you know, if you think about where we are today, you know, and I'm sitting in the water sector, but it's true in the energy sector as well, the amount of investment that is going to be needed in order to deliver climate change mitigation and, because it's not an or, and climate change adaptation, when the consensus right now is that we should be planning for 2, if not 3 degrees of global warming by 2050 is huge. This is a lot of money. This is rewiring the energy grid. This is equipping the gas grid to deal with hydrogen. This is building new water storage. It's building new interconnectors. It's improving drainage. I mean, you know, it's improving sea defences. It's huge. And then if you also factor on top of that something that we're seeing a lot of, and absolutely rightly, strong desire among citizens for improvements in the environment. And you'll have been, you know, party, I'm sure, to a lot of debates about the need for increasing water quality in rivers, for example. That's not what the current system was designed for. It is what consumers and citizens now expect. Getting from here to there is not cheap. So the question, you know, you have to start to ask is, how do we pay for this? And again, if you look back over history, you look back over the last sort of 20, 30 years since privatisation, systematically, when government has faced choices about how the costs of these kinds of, well, they are effectively public goods, are paid for, they've systematically chosen to put them through utility bills, more or less monopolistic utility bills, rather than have them fall on the taxpayer. And of course, what that means is that those costs are put through an essentially regressive bill system rather than being put through an essentially progressive tax system. And I think we do have to start to ask some questions about what that means for our approach to regulation. And I say this, you know, particularly acutely sitting in the water sector, because unlike energy, where actually retail is competitive and retail prices beyond the price cap, and there's a whole other debate I suspect you've been having about that, are not regulated. In water, obviously households are not able to choose their supplier, so the end-to-end price is regulated. And so there is a real, you know, debate that I think we need to have about what regulated bills, particularly for household consumers, look like if we are going to recover the costs associated with climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation, and environmental improvement through what is currently a very, very regressive bill structure. Now, clearly, part of the answer to that is to get a lot better at identifying customers in financial vulnerability and to do better things, more things, deeper things to support those consumers to help them to pay their bills. And it's great that the Consumer Council in Water, Consumer Council of Water in the water sector has kicked off an independent review of affordability, and they are asking some of those questions. I think it's really, really important. We are reopening the debate, for example, about whether there should be a national social tariff in water. You know, is it fair at the moment that the amount of support that customers in financial vulnerability get is not only varying by geography, it varies by which water company you have, it's also subject to the constraint that overall customers must be willing to pay for that support to those customers who receive it. So, you know, big debate to be had about that. But I think even beyond that, it's absolutely imperative that regulators really look to exploit absolutely every opportunity available to them, and regulated companies as well, to steam out every last cent of efficiency and to think differently about how we provide the fundamental services we provide, so that to the extent that we are creating some affordability issues and some issues for vulnerable customers, they are absolutely minimised because we are being as efficient as we humanly can be. There's a long way to go on that. And part of the answer to that is about how regulators support and encourage and enable innovation, because we need to find dynamic efficiencies as well as the usual tried and tested productive efficiencies. And I think a big part of that is about how we deliver a more systems thinking approach and stop looking, in my industry, for example, for water companies to solve problems within their own boundaries using their own toolkit, and start looking at partnerships between water companies, local authorities, NGOs, communities, in order to try and make the entire system work better. So I think, in a nutshell, we've come a long way. We've had some very useful and important wake-up calls, and we have done some good stuff to think differently about how we identify and think about and support customers in vulnerable circumstances. But I think we need to not underestimate the size of the challenge that is coming as we face into the need to achieve sort of genuine sustainability through a lot of these infrastructure sectors. And I think we need to not shy away from some very, very fundamental debates about how we do things differently, not only strictly speaking as they relate to support for customers in vulnerable circumstances, but also how we deliver efficiency across the piece. And if we don't do that, then we will find the wheels come off the regulated utility machine fairly quickly, which isn't what we all want, given the importance of the sectors to our economy and society. So anyway, looking forward to the discussion later on. I'm sure we'll pick up some of these points, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. A lot of really interesting points being made, and I think you conclude in a positive way that we've come a long way, but at the same time, as you mentioned, there are a lot of circular issues reappearing, and we have to think again about the financial vulnerability and how we're going to address it with these new sustainable developments in mind. We are, I'm sure, going to continue this talk in the Q&A, but for now, I would like to give the floor to our second speaker, Professor Cathy Hamilton from University of Strathclyde, Professor in Consumption, Markets and Society there in Glasgow, whose research focuses on how market-mediated culture impacts consumers, institutions, and society. In her research, Professor Hamilton prioritizes transformative impact on consumer well-being. And we are going to listen to her talk about the transformative role of community space, actually, and how that can help with consumer vulnerability. Please, the floor is to you. And I'm going to turn back my camera on when it's about time to finish, okay?
Okay, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm just going to share my screen with you. So my presentation today focuses on an ongoing project that is funded by the Leverhulme Trust. This is very much a collaborative project that I'm working on with some colleagues at the University of Strathclyde. And we are a very interdisciplinary group. So as well as my own background in consumer research, we also have feminist and architectural humanities perspectives coming through as well. This is actually one of the first times that I have presented this study. We're currently at that really exciting stage of data analysis whenever we're still trying to make sense of everything and think about the best way to present this work, both in academic perspective, but also beyond that. So hopefully I'll be able to give you a bit of a flavour of what we've been doing today. Before I get into that, I wanted to start, as requested, with our definition of consumer vulnerability. You can see it on the slide here. We characterise consumer vulnerability as an undesirable state catalysed by a number of human conditions and contexts. These conditions and contexts affect how individuals experience, interpret and respond to the marketplace, and often how the marketplace responds to them. This comes from the introduction of a book that I co-edited a few years ago with Susan Dunnett and Maria Piacentini, and we actually make some of the similar kind of comments to what Catherine has just covered in terms of the transient nature of consumer vulnerability. The book came on the back of a seminar series, an ESRC seminar series that we organised about the topic. And one of the things that emerged from a lot of our conversations during that seminar series that I thought would be worth mentioning at the outset today was the way in which sometimes there can be misconceptions about the market-centric language that I use within my discipline. So in other words, misconceptions about calling people consumers. And I think this is because the everyday definition of a consumer as somebody who buys goods and services is much narrower than the way in which consumption is understood within the discipline that I work in, within consumer research, where consumption is understood in terms of the whole consumer experience and the way in which consumption can impact society and culture more generally. So from that perspective, you can be a consumer without any money ever exchanging hands. And that's really the perspective I'm taking today by looking at consumers of a non-profit organisation. Our project is framed within the area of transformative service research. I've included a definition of that on the slide in case this is an area that you're not familiar with. TSR is quite different to traditional service research. So traditional service research would prioritize concepts such as loyalty and customer satisfaction. So concepts that would help improve the firm's profitability, whereas TSR research really centralizes the role of service in consumer well-being. What we wanted to do in terms of making a contribution was to add a spatial perspective to this body of work and explore how well-being could be enacted through the construction of the physical space. And this is the research question that we kind of set out to look at. So what are the transformative impacts of servicescapes on consumers' experience and vulnerability? There's been research across lots of different disciplines that really does establish this link between place and well-being, and that's what we're trying to build on. So there's been work within my own discipline that has looked at the way in which consumers can develop very deep and meaningful connections with commercial places. Also previous work that I have been involved in myself that has looked at therapeutic servicescapes. We want to build on that and show not just how spaces can be therapeutic, but how they can actually be transformative for the users of those spaces. So in terms of methods, this was a case study project where we were working alongside a non-profit hybrid community space. This was a space that was a museum, it's a library, it's an archive, and it runs a really extensive program of public events. And it was ideally suited to our purposes because a lot of the events and learning projects that it operates are very much targeted at people who could be considered to be vulnerable. So for lots of different reasons, so people who face different types of cultural, social and economic barriers. So for example, projects are targeted at survivors of domestic abuse, projects are targeted at adult literacy learners, at homeless people. So really, really diverse. And we've done lots of different things to try and understand this space. But today I'm prioritizing mainly the interviews. So we've spoken to 52 different people who have a relationship with the place in a variety of different ways. So some staff, some volunteers, some users, some leaders of the various workshops and events that I've just been speaking about. In many ways, it was slightly ironic as this project kicked off in April 2020. So we were all geared up to do some research about a community space. And because of lockdown, we actually haven't been able to spend a huge amount of time in the space ourselves. So we've had to slightly adapt some of our original plans to take account of the emerging situation. Starting off the findings, I wanted to highlight some of the feelings that people associated with spending time in this community space that we were exploring. So I have here a word cloud with some of the descriptors that were commonly used within the interviews. So you can see this was described as a space that was welcoming, supportive, nurturing, empowering. So all really positive ways of describing the space. And what we're interested in is trying to understand what it is about the space that raises these kind of positive sentiments. I'm hoping in many ways what I'm going to do in the next few slides follows on quite well from the conversation in the first session this morning, where a couple of people spoke about the importance of understanding the lived experience of people. So what I've tried to do in the next 3 or 4 slides is really to centralize the voices of lived experience and to show you just a couple of extracts that come from our interviews. I started with the idea of material space. I think one of the things that I think makes the organisation we're working with a bit unique is that the two managers both have training in art and design. So this is something that they really embed in every aspect of the organisation, and something that came up as being particularly beneficial within our interviews. The quotation on the left-hand side of the slide comes from a project leader, somebody who ran a project with young women aged between 15 and 25. And she really clearly articulated how important it was to have a space that was well taken care of. And that's something that emerged in a lot of the conversations, that a cared for space in turn makes users of the space feel that they are cared for and that they are worthy of attention. So these kind of environmental factors are not secondary, you know, they're not something that doesn't matter about, they're something that are really hugely crucial to the whole environment. On the right hand side here, you can see one of our illustrations. One of the things that we've done quite recently is shared some of our interview quotes with a professional illustrator, as we thought this might be quite a nice way when we start to share our findings, particularly within non-academic audiences, to get some of our key messages across. So I've included a couple of them throughout the presentation here today. And this one is intended to get across the way in which almost universally in pretty much every interview that we did, the warm welcome that you received whenever you went into this community space was mentioned as being hugely important. On this slide, I have two examples that show the more effective qualities of the space. There was hundreds of examples that I could have picked here, and I've selected just two. So the first one comes from Leslie. And Leslie talks about how at a certain point in her life, this community space was literally the only place other than her home where she felt comfortable. Leslie has Asperger's and she can find interaction difficult, but she has never felt anything other than safe and welcome within this organisation. And I think her words show just how significant that has been for her. The second quotation comes from Agnes. Agnes had spent many years looking after her elderly parents, and she's speaking here about the period in her life just after her father had died. And I think her words really meaningfully get across how important being in this space was for her. She says, I needed to be with other like-minded people like me because I had lacked that. And when I walked through that door and I met all these volunteers and we sat and we chatted, I just used to walk out the door. I used to feel as though I was walking on air. I just loved it. I needed to be empowered, encouraged. I needed all of that. So given all of this positivity, it did then raise some questions about what happens whenever this space is taken away because of the lockdown situation that we all find ourselves in. I thought to illustrate this point, I would turn to an example from Monica. Monica is retired and prior to the lockdowns had been a very regular user of this community space. And she's speaking here about how she had attended an online event on Zoom and how attending this event had made her realise how much she was missing spending time in the space, how much she was missing the kindness and the care that were exhibited within this organisation space. And I think this organisation that we've been working with, they've made huge efforts to transition online, and our findings certainly brought out a lot of benefits of that really reflected of the broader narrative of the way in which these kind of online events have accessibility benefits. But I think at the same time as that, there was an equally strong narrative that we can't underestimate the value of these physical community spaces in terms of how important they can be in their users' lives. The last slide of quotations, and this is really just moving it forward slightly to think then, well, how can this space be transformative for the people who use it? There was lots of really quite concrete examples of this. So we have people making a direct link to the way in which interacting with this space had helped them make choices about their education, about their career, had helped them make choices about their family situations. And what it shows us was that the benefits of interacting with this space really extended beyond its physical boundaries to life more generally. So we have one example here from Zoe. Zoe has a chronic illness, which means that she can't work full time. And she spoke about the importance of this space in re-establishing her confidence. And on the left-hand side, our little illustration here, I think sums it up very nicely, says it was just an overwhelming positive experience for me. It was quite life-changing. And last slide, just to try and summarize this very quickly, it shows the community space can offer important support for people experiencing vulnerability. Because I'm short on time, I'm just going to jump straight to the last quotation. This comes from another academic paper that resonated quite strongly with me. This was a paper that shows how consumers can use space to reassert the value of their cultural identity. So if their identity had been devalued in some way, space could be a resource that they used strategically to reestablish their identities. So I think I am out of time, so I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's amazing to hear that these sort of spaces exist and how big of a change they can make in people's life. And I would be very keen to hear whether you've also looked at other spaces and have some sort of comparison also as to what brings the best effects in causing this transformation and providing this encouraging and safe environment. But I hope we'll get back to it in the Q&A. And for now, we have, last but not least, definitely, Dr. Mateja Dziurowicz, who's a reader in contract and commercial law and the co-director of the Center for Technology, Ethics, Law and Society at King's College London. And unsurprisingly, considering his co-directorship, his recently focuses on digital rights of consumers and the framework of protection that consumers can be awarded in the digital sphere. And that's also, I think, what he's going to talk to us today about.
Yes, thank you very much, Joasha, for this very kind introduction. And again, many thanks to the conference organizers, to Team Christine for very kind invitation. It's really my great pleasure and honor to be online with you. I had some problems with connecting, so actually I also prepared the slides, but I don't want to share them because I'm scared that the entire system might simply again stop working. So I'll just be kind of talking. And I'm going to focus on one kind of particular case study on protection of vulnerable consumers in case of TikTok. Now, to set up the scene, I am primarily interested in, and my research focus is on consumer law, and I'm in particular kind of, as Joasha pointed out, now I'm looking how does the existing consumer law fits into this kind of the process of the digitalization of the market, because on the one side, consumer law needs to protect some of the fundamental values, including kind of the vulnerable consumers as very important players and very kind of affected players of the market affected by the process of digitalization. Whereas on the other side, consumer law must not be seen as an obstacle to further development of the new technologies, in particular towards the digitalization of the market. And I always, when we talk about consumer law is interestingly one of the legal disciplines that has been really heavily regulated, and that there are really a lot of rules which seem very nice and very protective, especially when we talk, for example, also about the vulnerable consumers. They're but when it comes to their application in practice, we are faced with a number of problems. And we can actually, only when we look at how consumer law is applied in practice, we can see exactly how many deficiencies there are when it comes to application of consumer law in practice. And this is another thing which really interests me a lot. And I was luckily, and to my great pleasure, earlier this year involved a bit to provide kind of legal opinion in the context of big proceedings that several consumer organizations in Europe have initiated against TikTok. And I found that, and when we talk about that interesting case, because it also demonstrates very well about some of the challenges that are posed to the concept of vulnerable consumer in the digital world. And that's what I find really kind of interesting. Now, when we talk about TikTok, interestingly, when I was supposed to kind of understand better the world, I heard of TikTok, but and I simply had to do more research to properly understand it. Why? Well, because unlike other social networks like Facebook or Instagram, or especially LinkedIn, where kind of people of all ages are actually part of, TikTok is primarily aimed at the younger crowd, primarily young, that like teenagers. And if we look kind of the statistics, we can see how many young people actually have their accounts at the TikTok. And it is one of the fastest growing social networking that especially has grown during the pandemic of COVID-19, being one of the most downloaded, according to some studies, even the most downloaded application during the first year of the coronavirus. When we talk about the UK approach, only in the UK in 2020, the UK user base grew by 75.2%, reaching the number of 8.5 million users. In that sense, both year 2020 and year 2021 are particularly notable because the usage will exceed of 10% of the UK population, and it is expected that this number will actually surpass the number of the 10 million of users next year in the UK. Interestingly, I think also what's very important to note is that TikTok is owned by a company, by a Chinese company, ByteDance, which, like, being a Chinese, is actually based in the People's Republic of China, which is again very important because the standards of consumer protection in People's Republic of China do differ much in comparison to those that exist in the European Union and the UK, bearing in mind, of course, that UK consumer law, even today's stance, is actually heavily based on the EU consumer law. I again find this again very interestingly because some years ago, and again I want to emphasize that TikTok is based in China, because some years ago we had this very interesting big pan-European case against the company Apple, and I remember that again because Apple was found to be engaged into a number of unfair commercial practices and also breach of the European rules on consumer sales, but eventually one of the defenses of the lawyers of Apple was very surprising, saying, okay, we are kind of Californian, American-based company. Sorry, we didn't know we have kind of our global policy. So we are very sorry, we didn't know we had to comply with European consumer law. So having said that, it's very interesting, and that's actually, I'm writing a paper on it, exactly implying with this TikTok case study, how these rules in case of TikTok actually apply to the how they fit in within the existing legal frameworks for consumer protection provided by the European Directive 2005/29 EC on unfair commercial practices and 93/13 on unfair contract terms. And what's also very important to note is that, again, what I keep saying, that category of consumers which is particularly affected by the TikTok, that actually TikTok is actually children and younger consumers. And if we kind of look at the European concept of vulnerable consumers, we can always look at Peter has also talked about that, the famous Directive 2005/29 EC on unfair commercial practices that has for the first time brought this European concept of vulnerable consumer that is to be seen as kind of the third category of consumers, because we have the main average consumer of that includes all consumers. If particular practice affects an entire group of consumers, we look to the average member, and as well kind of we have targeted average consumer, and then as a kind of third category we have the concept of vulnerable consumers, and the directive itself in recital provides us with some kind of explanation. But again, I think that this concept of vulnerability and the concept of vulnerable consumers is one of the least, and I would say kind of worst explained concepts brought by the European Directive on Unfair Commercial Practice. So during the last 16 years, we have really very little guidance brought to us by the Court of Justice of the European Union. What is meant under the concept of vulnerability, and what is this particular protection that is needed in the concept of protection of vulnerable consumers in case of unfair commercial practice. Interestingly, when we talk about the Directive 93/13 on unfair contract terms, we do not have the classical benchmark for assessment. In this case, what should be applied in the context of transparency of contract terms in consumer contracts. And we do not have a benchmark. Only as of the decision of the Court of Justice of the European Union in 2014, we have this idea that, average consumer is the one that is also being taken as the benchmark for assessment of transparency of the contract terms. And ipso facto, we can also conclude that, the category of vulnerable consumers can also be used as an example of as a subsidiary benchmark for assessment of transparency of contract terms. Also, what's very important to note is that even like kind of on the other side of the ocean, we had the example of in the United States, even in 2019, where actually again TikTok was accused, and actually there was kind of accused exactly for kind of particularly affecting the teenagers by breach of the data protection rules, by collection of their data. And eventually, of course, this has not been ended as a judgment by the court, but there was a settlement, and as a result, the company had to pay an amount of $5.7 million when in relation to breach of privacy laws related to the protection of children. So even you can see that even in some other jurisdictions with kind of less protective measures for kids, this has been TikTok has been fine. Also, what's very interesting here when you talk about TikTok, because some of the big problems in relation to regulation of the TikTok were the fact that some of its consumers were found to be children even of the age of 8, 9, 10, 11. So eventually there was the TikTok agreed to change its policy to prevent children from below 13 to kind of become users, and as well as children below 18 to buy any kind of products. In particular, here I mean the tokens that are offered for some remuneration by the TikTok, and that's kind of the way how kids actually use TikTok for some things, to exchange these tokens and to collect them, and that's also very important. But again, interestingly, TikTok, the way how actually TikTok is checking this is simply that every single user is now obliged to insert its date of birth, which is something that of course can be very easily manipulated, and that's the kind of another issue. And I think that, for example, in the context of new technologies can definitely be used to kind of try to assess what is the real age of a person using TikTok, and in that sense to protect the children which are kind of particularly vulnerable. Now, also, what's very interesting to note is that this case also is taking place in different jurisdictions. For example, in Hungary, the Hungarian Competition Authority started an investigation against TikTok, and it was shown that TikTok has a capacity to generate vast amounts of consumer data, especially of the children, and shower its users with different advertisements. And that's something that Hungarian Competition Authority tries to address. I mean, this has still not been kind of finalized. the proceeding in Hungary. Also, another very interesting thing is what happened in Hungary was they did that many of the information provided to the users of the TikTok were not provided in the Hungarian language, is the only official language in Hungary, but they were provided in English. So like that's another kind of the question of the English. So that's definitely another thing that needs to be addressed. Now, when it comes to current situation, also what's going on, for example, in Ireland, the case is again pending, and again, as I tried to point out, one of the things that the Irish the Data Protection Commission is trying to check in connection with processing of personal data for the use under the age of 18, and also the age verification process introduced by the TikTok for for the users are above the age of 13. That's something that in Italy has already been done. As we all know, the Italian authority in charge of protection of the market and competition has been very active, and it has also, like earlier this year, ordered TikTok to stop collecting and using children's data. So that's also kind of a very important development. Also, what I find particularly kind of important in this kind of of the cases is that they clearly demonstrate how clearly today in the modern world the rules on consumer protection are tightly connected with the data protection. So in this context of the commercialization of the data, in particular of the vulnerable categories, because in this situation we had like TikTok that was collecting and storing and eventually selling the data of its users. And I have to point out that a huge number of users of TikTok are actually under the age of 18, and in such a context they are definitely considered as the vulnerable consumers. And that's something that, you know, from the perspective of the directive 93/13 on unfair contract terms and the requirements of transparency, that this is something that definitely needs to be addressed, because the privacy issues are definitely very important, and they are something that's kind of to be protected. And you know, having said that, it's like I have mentioned this Italian proceedings. So we have similar things that another authority, Italian Data Protection Commissioner, tried to point it out that, you know, TikTok should have created a special section for minors in simple language, which would highlight the particular risks posed to them. And again, that's something that's been kind of pointed out, that the limited number of the European languages which TikTok displays its policies is something that is kind of potentially being very important. And I used the example of the Hungarian authority. To sum up, I really find, as I try to point out, this example of the TikTok as something very interesting, because first it shows to us how on the example of one of the most used and most downloaded social networks that is in particular attractive, and it's in particular used by the vulnerable categories of consumers, how the traditional consumer law works, in particular the directives 2005/29 on fair commercial practices and directive 93/13 issued on fair contract terms. And also on the other side, it also demonstrates very well the connection that in 2021, that like ever rising connection and ever tight, more risingly important connection that exists in the digital world between, on the one side, consumer protection rules, and on the other side, data protection rules, and the importance to properly protect the vulnerable category of consumers. As I said, like this case is still pending, and I'm kind of following it. So I'm really looking forward to see what's going to be the outcome. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Matej. Definitely an interesting case of TikTok. I'm sure it was very interesting to be involved in it. And now having to think about how we can change consumer protection framework to accommodate such practices, and whether we can actually reconcile the benchmark vulnerable consumer with the transient character of consumer vulnerability. That's also a very interesting question to address. I'm inviting questions from the audience. I see that Christine Rifa had a question. Christine, would you like to ask it in person? Aha, yes.
Oh yeah, and then there she appears. I'm very happy to. Yeah, I mean, thank you so much to all the speakers. We obviously were promised a fascinating start of the afternoon, hasn't disappointed. My question was more directly to Catherine Ross to try and tap into obviously a great knowledge and also experience on the ground, which is a slightly different experience from what us academics do have. And I would be really keen to hear your views as to where you see the roadblocks and the difficulties that you've enumerated, and whether we can pinpoint whether they are a mix of things, or whether perhaps they are more political or sociological or economic, or are they legal? Is there a way we can perhaps label the roadblocks? And I understand perhaps that would be too simplistic, but that would be helpful from my point of view. And also, it's a double question. What would you see the most important change to make to break through and truly assist vulnerable consumers?
Wow, what a question. Yes, I think the most important change, if I can start with that one, it's kind of obvious, but it's really hard. And it's just kind of breaking down barriers, stopping thinking about the stuff in silos. And actually, I think Matteo touched on some of this as well when he was talking about, the linkages between, the way that we regulate tech, data protection, different forms of regulation. The issues that we have now in the consumer space cut across traditional regulatory institutional boundaries, they cut across legal systems, they cut across countries, they cut across sectors, and it's just about this massive shift in how human beings are interacting with the world, and therefore, where circumstances of vulnerability arise and what best way of dealing with those is. And anything we can do to break down those barriers and look at things through a different lens and take that genuinely customer-centric view of the world, super helpful. And actually, I think academia has a lot to offer in that space to us, because I think academics are jolly good at bringing that kind of challenge. In terms of roadblocks, I think there's a lot. Part of it is the usual problem of the biggest roadblock is the one in your head, which goes back to the barrier busting and thinking about things differently stuff. I do think there's a political issue though, and I think there is a political issue particularly on that point that I was raising about affordability in utility sectors. The reason I think there's a political issue here is because I used to work as a regulator, and I kind of know where regulators are comfortable and where regulators are uncomfortable. And one of the places where regulators get uncomfortable is when you're doing things in your regulated sphere where you're creating big losers and winners in society. Some groups lose a lot, some groups gain a lot. And as an unelected official, you're feeling uncomfortable at that point because you're thinking, actually, this is a bit sort of social transfer territory. And actually, I would like a little bit more legitimacy than I feel like I have to do this stuff. So I think if you are talking about the sort of thing that I was talking about earlier on, about making bills more progressive, changing tariff structures, national social tariff, things like that, regulators can go so far in precipitating the conversation, companies can go so far, but I think we all need some political cover because actually we're changing the distribution of winners and losers in society, and that's something that governments ought to have something to say on. So I just want to single out that one.
Thank you so much. I cannot possibly deny our conference organizer, Tim. I see you have the question.
Yes, I can't resist, unfortunately. I have two questions, in fact. One I'm a little more comfortable with, and the other I'm less comfortable with. So I'll start with the comfortable one first. Catherine, I really like this idea of system thinking approach, and also using the fire brigade, for example, to identify vulnerable consumers. It was something that in 2018, Christopher Bisping and I tentatively suggested and came up against a roadblock that I really hope you have the answer to. And that is, what happens if a consumer doesn't want to be identified as vulnerable? In fact, if the stigma of being identified as vulnerable actually exaggerates their vulnerability, how can we go against that? Because one of the ideas we were proposing was that we found that social services, for example, were just not communicating with energy regulators, with energy companies, and not even with the energy regulator on these topics. So that would be my question to you. And then Kathy, this is far outside my area, but it's something that I've experienced firsthand in the last 2 years. I've been involved in a local community shop, and I found that as a space, it has invited a whole range of help to consumers, particularly on essential services, quite incidental. To what extent did you find that the incidental services of the space were vital in promoting that sense of community, that sense of space for them to approach others, to talk, as it were? I hope that makes sense.
Catherine, would you like to?
Yeah, I can pick up your question about systems thinking first. Yes, I think systems thinking is so important. And actually, I was at a seminar a couple of weeks ago where we spent almost 20 minutes trying to persuade people that systems thinking was not the same as central planning. So I think we need to spend a little bit more time just being clear what we mean about systems thinking. You are right. There is this huge issue about people not wishing to identify themselves or be identified as vulnerable. And to be honest, I get it. And I think we need to stop labeling people, and we just need to start understanding human beings and the circumstances that they're in, and some human beings need a bit of help, and that'll actually be most of us at some moment in time. And just because I need help, I don't necessarily want to sit here with a big label of vulnerable stuff on top of me. And I think we should be able to get better at spotting the triggers and spotting when people need some extra assistance. In a much more sort of real time, much more fluid, much more human way, rather than sort of putting somebody in a category or taking them out of the category. And I think this is where actually, some of the technology that we're using, I think it has the potential to do some real good, because it's a lot easier. I mean, Thames, for example, our systems are awful. They're really old and really clunky. The good news is we're replacing them and we're making them better, which means that we can leapfrog. And so part of what we're trying to do is just make it really easy for customers themselves to flag, I need some help, or indeed take the flag off. I don't need any help anymore, without sort of stigmatizing that. And also we're able to do more in terms of understanding and analyzing what people say when they ring us, and if when somebody's talking to us, there is a little bit more of a gap between what we say and when they respond. Maybe that does prompt, actually, is that person suffering maybe some cognitive issues? Maybe I should slow down. So there are things that you can build into your systems for your customer contact people that might just prompt the question in their mind by doing little bits of real-time analytics. It doesn't mean we need to label somebody as vulnerable. We're just saying that somebody might need a little bit more time to understand what we're saying. And I think that is the key to it. But you are right, there are still some issues around data sharing. I mean, the pain we went through of trying to do this deal with UK power networks as to how they would share information with us. Really hard work. And I think there has to be a bit more attention, I think, paid to intent and the intent behind data sharing. And maybe there's data sharing that we should make easier, and some data sharing that we might even want to make harder. That's perhaps a little bit of the debate that Matteo was raising earlier on. But anyway, I will shut up and Kathy can answer the question that you put to her.
Yes, thanks, Tim. So I think probably the most straightforward answer to your question is that I don't think it's possible to single out any one particular aspect that makes this space transformative. It's the way in which everything comes together. So it is the formal services that they offer alongside the informal community feel that creates, and I think both are really equally important. I don't think I could pick attending this particular class or going to this particular project is the key thing. It's all of it together. which is maybe a slight cop out of an answer, but I actually think that's genuinely the truth.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thanks,
I know we should be finishing, but I'm going to abuse my position as chair now to ask the final question to Mateja. Considering we've been mentioning in the discussions that it's really difficult to assign these labels, and especially around vulnerability. But obviously, consumer protection actually has that label and that benchmark of vulnerable consumers, which is used rarely, and it's definitely insufficient, but we have it. What's the next step then? How can we accommodate all this debate we have on vulnerability and how better to address it through the consumer protection framework?
Yeah, Asha, that's definitely a very good point that you're making. I mean, we do have it and it's been in place for the last 16 years. But if you kind of look at as I pointed out, to the case law of the Court of Justice, and it's been really kind of restrictively used, and the court is always kind of very cautious about using it. So there is definitely a lot of room and a lot of need for improvement. And one of the things why kind of I'm looking at this interesting TikTok case is exactly to assess how is the best way to protect vulnerable consumers. And I think, you know, one of the the things that I'm trying to suggest is as UK consumer law is not anymore bound to follow the European consumer law model. I think that, you know, in the UK there should be we should try to build a new concept of vulnerable consumers to be used as a benchmark, and to try to definitely apply it more in practice and to try to clarify what it means. Because to start with, yes, you're right. I mean, there is this concept of vulnerable consumers brought by the European consumer law, but, you know, to start with, it has not yet been clarified what it really means in practice. We have some kind of explanation in practice what is meant by this vulnerability, and but it really misses a lot of clarification and misses a lot of application in practice. So I think that's now a good moment, as we kept. That's one of the things I really learned a lot myself at this interdisciplinary conference. It was a great hearing how there is definitely a need to to define a new concept of vulnerable consumer in the UK, and now we have possibility not to follow anymore what is said on the European level. I think that's something that could be improved. And, you know, definitely I think that, you know, the concept of vulnerability, at least when I kind of look at the example of TikTok, there is a lot of connection, a lot similar that connects data protection on the one side rules with the consumer protection rules.
Thank you, Mateja.
Yeah.
I wanted to start saying that maybe we will get a new benchmark of consumer vulnerability in the UK sooner than in the EU, but then I thought about how long it took with everything about Brexit, and generally how long it takes UK Parliament to also come to a consensus. So I'm not sure they would be faster than the Commission. Thank you so much for all the interesting discussions, presentations, and I'm hoping that the conference further will go well as well. And I think we are gathering again at 3:30. Thank you.